It takes Zoom a minute or so to add everybody into the room, so please sit tight and we'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you. Morning, everyone. It takes Zoom about a minute to add everybody into the room. So if you're already with us, please sit tight and we'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you so much. Okay, hopefully Zoom has had time to add everybody into the room. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke media briefing on COVID-19 and the upcoming election. I am Greg Phillips with Duke Communications and I'm moderating this event. The country remains in the grip of the pandemic. The election is less than a month away. The president has COVID-19 and talks in Washington over a stimulus package to help American families have stalled. Could 2020 get any more chaotic? If we've learned anything from this year so far, it's that the answer to that question is always yes. But we have three Duke scholars with us today to discuss the economic effects of this ongoing turmoil on businesses, families, and the economy as a whole. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. Thank you to the reporters who already sent questions. During this discussion, those of you joining us on Zoom can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions in person in a few minutes. Thanks also to everyone watching this on YouTube. With us today is John Graham. He is a professor of finance at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business, where he teaches and researches corporate finance. Graham also directs the CFO survey, a long-running quarterly measure of CFO optimism and economic outlook. Good morning to you. Also joining us is 𝐓𝐚 𝐏𝐚𝐧𝐞. He is a professor of the practice and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Economics at Duke's Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, where he studies financial market development and regulation. Good morning.
Good morning.
And we have Muriel Beasley. She is co-director of the Common Sense Lab at the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke, which uses behavioral science to improve financial decision-making in families with low to moderate incomes. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And Muriel Beasley, we'll start with you. You've been studying how families have been responding financially to the pandemic. What does your research show about the need for another economic stimulus right now?
Yeah, so first, the pandemic has really impacted different people in different ways, right? We think of this as sort of, we're all in this together, but the truth is that different households are being sort of impacted and affected in different ways. So we recently ran a survey in sort of late August, early September, and found that about 65% had said that they had been financially impacted, either that they had lost a job or had their hours or salary cut. So there's a substantial portion that have, this very direct impact on their household budget. And what we have seen is sort of in the very beginning, people were really, motivated to save. We saw, personal savings rates increase. We saw, all of this, people really kind of thinking about the future, protecting for it. But as the pandemic has kind of continued on and these households have been impacted, a lot of folks have had to eat into a lot of that savings that they've had. And it, as also part of our survey that we recently ran, essentially in our own survey, 40% reported that their savings would only last a month or less still to go. And when you look sort of at 3 months out, now all of a sudden 70% say that their savings won't last past 3 months. So, and this really corresponds with some other national surveys that are estimating that, about 61% or so just don't have enough savings to last at the end of the year. So, without additional infusions of cash into these households, many of those are going to have to start making very difficult choices around, giving up food, figuring out different ways to make their rent payments, giving up medication, things like that, really hard choices because, they simply just don't have the cash flow on hand to kind of continue to buffer for much longer.
Thank you very much. Certainly lots more to dig into there, and we will. But for a second now, I'd like to zoom out. And Professor 𝐓𝐚𝐧𝐞, I'd like to move to you. This last week has really put the markets in flux. Can you tell us kind of how they've reacted to the stimulus delay so far? And does history tell us anything about what we can expect next?
Yeah, it's always really hard to see exactly what the markets have in mind, but I really think that you're right that the markets are very much reacting to the news about stimulus. In the short term, the markets are really super focused on that. And so every time there is another potential delay, the market really reacts negatively to that. The news yesterday that the president backed off on his unwillingness to negotiate about the stimulus drove the market back up. So there's a lot of watching and waiting for whatever stimulus comes out on the part of the market. And I think that in the near term, that's really going to be the dominant story about what the market's doing. The other thing I think is really still interesting to point out is that the other driving force in the market is the volatility about election uncertainty. If you look at the volatility measures, the market itself is forecasting out a really highly contested election. And so all the way out through the end of November, the market is certainly worried about the uncertainty surrounding the outcome of the election.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, that's certainly another uncertain cog in the wheel, and I'd like to ask you more about that. But we will move on to Professor Graham. Unemployment spiked massively at the start of the lockdown. Obviously, jobs are key to people maintaining themselves financially. We've seen some recovery since, but for the millions of people who lost jobs through the pandemic, employment growth is absolutely crucial. Now, your latest survey of CFOs wrapped up last month. What are CFOs saying about their employment plans over the next year?
Great. Well, thank you, Greg. So we've been doing a survey for over about 25 years, and so we've had about 100 surveys, and I'd have to say the last few have been some of the most interesting. Just to give you a little context, in February, the US was at pretty much a 50-year low for unemployment rate, okay? Then the crisis hits, March, April, May, unemployment rate goes up, as fast as the unemployment rate has ever grown. And as you mentioned, now about half of that has been recovered back, which is a good thing, but we still have the other half of those employees unemployed. And everyone wants to know, when will they become employed again? So we asked on this quarter's survey, compared to where you were before the crisis started, where's your employment picture now? Where will it be at the end of this year? And where will it be at the end of next year, okay? And so what we found is, of course, just confirming what we already know, is that compared to before the crisis, employment is low right now, down several percentage points from where we were before the crisis. That's why the unemployment rate is higher. What about by the end of this year? Well, here things get a little interesting. We see for small firms that there will actually be some recovery by the end of the year. Employment will, from where we stand today, employment will still be lower than it was pre-crisis, but only by about a percentage point. Now, part of that is because there has actually been a surprising amount of creation of new businesses in the past few months. Many of these are services dedicated to coming by your house and fixing your bicycle for you so you don't have to go into the shop. Very small businesses, things like that. But that is employment, okay? And so that part of employment won't get back to where we were, but we'll make some good progress towards that by the end of the year. What about large firms? So large firms employ a lot of people, right? Large firms won't recover as much in employment by the end of this year. They'll still be down by about 3 percentage points at the end of this year, okay? And the same pattern kind of holds into 2021, where small firms will actually be growing and large firms will still be below water. Now, why is that? Well, is it because large firms are struggling more? They don't have financial resources? I don't think so. I think what's going on is large firms have a lot of pieces that they can move around to keep operating, and they can take a person and shift them over to do another task or to do two people's tasks type of thing. I think what we're going to discover here is that large firms have figured out how they can operate with fewer employees. So when it's all said and done, I think large firms will be more efficient, which sounds good from a business perspective, but that means operate with fewer employees. So in one sentence, employment is recovering. We'll still be down at the end of this year, and we will still be down at the end of next year compared to pre-crisis, primarily because large firms won't rehire some of their employees.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Professor Graham. We've got a lot to dig into here, but I will open it up to questions now. So if you are joining us on Zoom, you can type a question in the Q&A window that I can ask, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and we can unmute you so that you can ask the question yourself. If you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 and we can unmute you that way. Professor 𝐓𝐿𝐿𝐼, I'd like to come back to you. You've talked about the uncertainty in the markets, and obviously there's so much uncertainty in personal decision making at the family level right now. And because uncertainty is at the heart of so many decisions that people have to make, what are some things that governments can do, certainly in the absence of a stimulus, to maybe mitigate that uncertainty somewhat and help people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's lots that government can do. And this week we learned a lot more about transmission, especially the so-called aerosol transmission. I think one thing that governments could do immediately is to help people understand what the transmission rates are going to be in enclosed spaces, especially places like restaurants, and also whether some simple mitigation measures like air filters could really help to reduce the transmission. I mean, one of the things I'm really concerned about is going into the winter. A lot of small businesses that are still hanging on, think places like restaurants who can still serve outside. The weather's going to turn cold and they're going to have to move inside, and that may be a death blow to a lot more restaurants. So figuring out whether it's still safe to do things like indoor dining or indoor shopping or going to the movies, I think that could be really critical to local and national economies, and governments could really step up and provide information that would help people understand the true risks, and maybe give them the confidence to go back out.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Muriel Beasley, I'd like to come back to you on this notion of uncertainty. Your research center works with families on making difficult financial decisions. But when there's so much uncertainty about what's happening today, what may happen next week, next month, how much harder does that make those decisions? And what kind of advice can you give to people who are facing unprecedented uncertainty?
Yeah, so uncertainty can be a really paralyzing factor for a lot of people. And when people are kind of unsure about what to do, it really complicates the decision-making process. And this makes it incredibly difficult to plan for the future. And what we see is that either what happens is sort of optimism bias takes over, where people sort of are overly optimistic about what the future looks like, so then they don't necessarily plan well for it. Or it becomes so incredibly paralyzing that they kind of stick with their defaults and don't make any changes that they maybe need to make in order to sort of have some of these better outcomes. So, and when I talk about some of those paralyzing decisions, it's that, when it's really uncertain about whether or not you're going to get a stimulus, or it's really uncertain about what the risks are, or it's really uncertain about what the economy is going to look like, in a month or two. What that means is that people may think that, okay, well, I'll just continue to kind of skip my rent payments and not, think about this because it's going to get better in the future because there's so much uncertainty. This obviously is what happens is something that we refer to as the ostrich effect. We kind of bury our heads in the sand. We choose to kind of not try to resolve things that feel uncomfortable and things like that until it sort of blows up in our face. And then all of a sudden it's, the day that households are getting evicted that they're trying to then figure out and navigate and understand what their options are and where to go. And that's, really the worst time to be trying to solve a problem is sort of when you're in the middle of it. Similarly, as we see the sort of household balance sheets going down and people are going to start, relying more and more on, food bank services and other ways to kind of get meals on the table. Again, the uncertainty around the recovery and the timing and the stimulus is that people essentially are going to be really hesitant about kind of figuring out what are those available services in their community. And essentially what will happen is that they'll wait to start doing that until there's absolutely no food left in the pantry and there's no income coming in, rather than thinking of it as a supplement to help stretch their savings longer. So this uncertainty just essentially is really going to delay people's ability to make better plans moving forward and understand and basically say, great, these are the decisions that we're going to make right now that are going to come into effect in 2 months or 3 months, because big decisions take time. Figuring out a way that you can reduce your housing costs, that's not a decision you can usually solve in a day, but oftentimes because we've delayed making decisions, we're kind of forced to try to solve those in a day.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think we all realize that there isn't a person on the planet who hasn't exercised avoidance at times when there is a problem coming down the pipe. We've had some questions come in, which is great. Professor Graham, one kind of point of order question for you is, could you explain, when you talk about large firms versus small firms, kind of what the differentiation is, what the criteria are between those two?
Right. That was a bit of an arbitrary cutoff. By small, I meant 500 or fewer employees, and large, I meant greater than 500 employees.
Sure, gotcha. And another question to go along with that. In the first round of stimulus that came through, small and mid-sized businesses got millions of dollars, you know, with the goal that it was supposed to help retain employees. Have you had any sense through the survey of what kind of a difference that made, and whether, you know, whether another stimulus would make a difference to business?
Great question. Yeah, I do think that helped quite a bit, because of course, by retaining your employees, then the company didn't even need to repay the loan. If they, you know, followed the rules, it became a grant. And so many companies did retain their employees for the period of time that was required. Now, as that expires and we don't have another plan in place to replace it, some companies probably will lay off some of the employees they had kind of artificially retained as employed for the time being, and reduce payrolls. Some of those programs still do have some funding in them, so it's kind of petering out. It's not that we had a cold stop on those programs.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Fulenkamp, we've had a question come in from for you. You've mentioned about how the markets expect uncertainty from the election to last through the end of the year. Are there any predictions about how the market's likely to react based on who wins the presidency?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a really interesting because excuse me, in the short run, if there's a Biden win, the market is really expecting more stimulus to come out of a Biden administration. So the markets will react pretty positively to that. And every time new news comes out about a potential Biden win, that increases the probability of that, the market is reacting positively. In the longer term, though, the market will eventually realize that the Biden presidency has proposed some measures that are more negative for corporations, in particular things like increasing the corporate income tax rate quite substantially, and also there's also the worry that a Biden administration would reimpose some regulations and impose more regulations on business. So it's kind of an interesting long-short game, and the market is really focused, as I mentioned before, on the short-term stimulus, because really that's the main concern right now. Of course, considerations about your income taxes and regulation are going to become completely secondary if the economy is really struggling.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And Professor Graham, I'd like to come back to you, because I know that in the CFO survey, ever since President Trump became the Republican nominee back in 2016, you've kind of, in the early days, kind of tracked how companies were responding to the fact that he was a presidential candidate and then a president. Through the history of the surveys, I mean, what have you seen in terms of how companies respond when there is a change of presidency, and how they've responded in general to the unpredictability that's come along with President Trump?
Great question. This, as we all know, has been a very unusual year. Prior to this year, presidential cycles, we'd see companies kind of pausing, sort of how Mario was talking earlier with individuals. Companies would do the same thing when faced with uncertainty. They would kind of pause their activity and wait to see what was happening. So they would cut their spending. They wouldn't start that new project or double down on expansion. And then after the election was decided, whoever won, at least the uncertainty was resolved, and companies said, okay, we kind of understand where it's going. We can now proceed down that path. Well, this year, of course, we had the virus that really masks any of that type of behavior that might be happening right now because of the election. So it's hard to say, but I do think there is this element of resolving uncertainty, whether it be President Trump again or Joe Biden administration, that will help on the margin. Again, we have to get through the crisis as that is the virus crisis as the first and foremost, but resolving uncertainty does help. And I think the business sector will start taking some action along whichever path they see the economy going after the election's decided.
Absolutely, thank you. Just a reminder to everybody, you can, thanks for the questions we've had so far. You can post questions in the Q&A window or raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to be unmuted to ask a question yourself. Mario Beasley, I'd like to come back to you. With your studies of families, particularly families that are struggling, in the event that there is some agreement on a stimulus, what do you think is the most important element of that stimulus? Is it housing relief? Is it more, is the need more for food? And I realize obviously these are not binary decisions. People just need to have shelter and housing. But what would you like to see as part of a stimulus package that would be the most effective?
Yeah, so when we think specifically about households that are, there's, I guess to take a kind of a step back, there's kind of multiple purposes of stimulus package, right? So a stimulus package could be something that is really about trying to encourage spending in the economy, right? To sort of lift the whole thing versus, really kind of relieving the economic crunch and necessities that households are facing. And so different households will sort of spend that stimulus differently. And for many households, so just if we take what happened sort of with the last stimulus package, about 86% received some sort of financial assistance from the government, whether that was, the actual stimulus check, whether it was expanded unemployment benefits, or whether it was, their job continued because of the Paycheck Protection Program, or that they had some sort of loan deferral forbearance that they didn't need to make payments on. So, and essentially what's interesting is about the way that former stimulus sort of was used. Essentially about 28% basically said, I just used it on my necessities, right? It like literally just helped me put food on the table and keep a roof over my head. So that doesn't necessarily stimulate the economy, but it is really about protecting the household. And, about 46% essentially said it did allow me to, I would have made it through without this. So my basic necessities were already met, but this added stimulus really helped kind of make things easier. And in that group, it was more likely that they were able to, actually spend some of that at a local restaurant maybe, or at local businesses. And then, the remaining group, which was about another quarter of households, basically said it didn't go to impact my bottom line at all, but I was able to then spend it back into the economy. So I think it really depends on what is our goal. What is the purpose that we have for this stimulus? Do we really want it to be going towards small businesses? In which case, we would recommend having the stimulus be something that is, large enough to meet people's individual household needs. So getting that cash in hand, but having it, even in subtle ways, framed or marked as something to spend in local businesses or kind of restaurants, locations. Because the challenge is that even in a cash grant right now, people will kind of hold on to that and hoard it because of the uncertainty that we just kind of talked about. Households are very concerned about emergency savings. We're seeing a high interest in people building that emergency savings, holding on to that savings. And that's not really the point of the stimulus. So my sense is that what I would like to see in a stimulus package is a cash infusion, because we need to help those, 30% of households or so that are really teetering on the bench, but it needs to be large enough that it covers those necessities and then has parts of it that are earmarked for spending in local communities. Because those small businesses, local businesses, are so crucial to the sort of sustainability of our communities. And so making sure that it's large enough to have some go into that.
Sure, thank you very much. Professor 𝐓𝐿𝐴nkamp, we know that obviously a stimulus is needed, but is in many ways a kind of short-term patch. What policy recommendations do you have for kind of longer-term economic recovery? What do you think is needed?
Well, one of the things that we're really seeing about this, the pandemic recession, is that it is undoing so much of the progress that we made in the previous few years about getting especially low-income people elevated in terms of income and wealth, and also actually getting people who are formerly out of the workforce entirely back into the workforce. So I'm really concerned that all of that progress is rapidly being undone. And the jobless numbers that are coming out are kind of verifying that people are now dropping out of the workforce again in large numbers, and we're seeing the return of long-term unemployment. And I think that is really troubling on a number of fronts, including things like economic growth, but also things like income and wealth inequality. So I think what we need to do is pay attention to the underlying causes of inequality and joblessness, and really attack those. And I don't really have in mind things like jobs programs. What I really have in mind is things like more broad educational policies and packages to try to target people, give them the skills that they need to go forward. I think it's really telling. Getting back to John's earlier comment about the surge in entrepreneurship, I'm a little bit cynical about that, because I think a lot of people are kind of forced into entrepreneurship because they lost jobs and they're just trying to make ends meet for the near term. So I think that we're seeing a substitution in quality of employment also, and that is also troubling, because that's going to be bad for economic growth as well, if people are just going to be living hand to mouth in whatever jobs that they create for themselves. So I really think that going forward, we're going to have to be very concerned about job creation and also business creation, right? We've lost so many small and medium-sized businesses, and we're on track to lose many more before this is all done.
Sure, thank you. And Professor Graham, I'd like to come back to you. You mentioned earlier about how the virus is kind of masking how firms might be responding to other kinds of uncertainty. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about how companies have responded to COVID, because you studied internal company business plans and found that firms reacted with a lot more flexibility to COVID than they did, for example, in the 2008 financial crisis. Can you tell us how that worked and why it's important and what it might mean for how companies are kind of fundamentally changing?
Right. So we've been surveying companies in March, in June, September. So we've been following them through this crisis. And as you mentioned, flexibility is key here. Okay. Now, what do you mean by flexibility for companies? There's financial flexibility, and that's very similar to what Mario's been talking about. Does a company have cash that they can use, or can they access a loan? Okay. There's employment flexibility. Can you keep your employees working through the crisis? Not so much at a restaurant, but yes, at Duke University, professors can keep working from home, and other industries. And the third is what we call investment flexibility. So just to try to get to the bottom line, in this crisis, financial flexibility does matter, okay? And it mattered a lot in 2008 also. So you might remember the 2008-2009 recession was about the banking sector and the housing sector and financial markets. And so when companies had a lot of financial flexibility, they either had cash or they could borrow, those companies made it through reasonably well. They didn't have that financial flexibility, they suffered greatly. Same thing is happening now. But this is a very unique crisis this year because it's really a health crisis that's affecting the business and finance of the world, okay? And so employment flexibility is super important now. The companies that can continue to have their employees work productively are doing reasonably well, okay? Some of them even hiring more employees. For example, Amazon is just one example. That didn't happen in 2008, 2009, in the sense that we still went to restaurants and the grocery store and we weren't wearing masks. So employment flexibility really wasn't that relevant back 10 years ago. And then this investment flexibility is very interesting too. What I mean by that is, can a company start or stop their investment in their capital spending as they build more machines, et cetera? And some companies can't. So like Intel has this assembly line going, the type of investing they do not want to disrupt that. If they're doing it, they want to keep doing it at a steady pace. Whereas other types of businesses do have a lot of flexibility with their investment, all right? And so for example, if I'm a freight trucking firm, I can just buy fewer trucks if demand is down, okay? So I have a lot of flexibility there. And so here's the punchline of where I'm going. What we found is that companies that have good prospects right now, that have investment flexibility, they're actually spending more now than they otherwise would have without the crisis, because they need to buy more servers and data processing, et cetera, to facilitate this work from home aspect. Whereas overall though, many more companies are cutting investment because their prospects aren't good and they have the flexibility to cut investment. So if you add that all up, investment is down, but it's very interesting to notice that you might say there's winners and losers in the economy, more losers than winners right now. But we don't want to lose track that there are some businesses actually doing reasonably well, hiring more people, investing more. It's just the majority are the worst, the opposite is happening and they're cutting.
Sure, thank you. And I've got some more questions I'd like to ask about that, but we have had a question come into the Q&A, and Professor Fullenkamp, I'll come to you first. The question is there a benefit to Congress approving a few smaller relief packages, for example, one for families, one for airlines, etc., as opposed to one large package, which it seems would obviously require more agreement in Congress, which I don't know if it's very likely, but what's your take on that?
Well, certainly, if the possibility of having targeted packages in which legislators put a lot of thought into the individual relief is certainly to be desired. I have a lot of doubt, though, that Congress will be able to pass a series of relief packages. So I think it's just politically infeasible, and I think that's one of the reasons why we see these big bundled packages. I mean, even when you go back to the relief from the global financial crisis, we saw the same thing happening. So just the political realities, I think, are prohibitive here. They have to put together big single pieces of legislation that have enough votes on both sides of the aisle to get through to Congress. And I just think that despite the fact that targeted relief would be better, I just don't think that we're going to get that. It's just not politically feasible.
Sure. Yeah, that certainly seems a clear-eyed assessment of the situation. Muriel Beasley, I wanted to ask you about this. You know, we know that when it comes to families, these are the stimulus is these are existential questions that families are having to answer about food and about shelter. If there isn't a second stimulus package and employment, as we know from Professor Graham, is going to take a long time to rebound. I mean, what kind of worst case scenario are we looking here as winter is creeping in? You know, earlier this year, we saw that evictions were kind of placed on hold. Do you see any signs of, in the absence of a stimulus, that maybe evictions will once again be placed on hold? Or is America looking at a potential homelessness crisis?
That's a great question. And I wish I could foresee the future and predict this better, but my hunch is that it will, there will, even with, eviction holds and things like that, there will, and loan forbearance extensions and things like that, this will inevitably still have a major impact on households. I think that we will see an increase in homelessness. We will see an increase in reliance on food assistance, on our public benefits programs. We will see an increased reliance on charities, local charities that are helping kind of fill the gap where government doesn't close that gap. I think that feels a bit inevitable at this point, knowing the timeline for recovery, the likelihood of the jobs coming back. Additionally, I think people are, I do think one thing that I'm optimistic about is that as I mentioned, not everybody has been equally impacted in the pandemic. And I do think that we will see as more and more stories come out about households that are struggling, families that are evicted, I do think that we will see an increase in charitable donations as well from sort of some of the disparate effects, where, we have some households who have not been impacted at all, but their spending has still decreased. So their savings is going up. Maybe their investments are doing well. And I do think that as it becomes sort of more and more visible about the way that households are being impacted, I do think that we'll see increases in, people giving to food banks and things like that to try to help meet those needs. I don't think it'll be enough. I still think we will see a major uptick in homelessness. Housing was already an issue going into this, and this has certainly not made it easier.
Absolutely. Yeah, please, please.
The one thing I was going to add is, we did actually, in our survey, we did ask about, what people thought would happen if there was no additional, infusion of cash or stimulus for households. And almost half of our sample felt like that this would essentially lead to a breakdown in American society. I'm sure some of that might be a little bit extreme, but essentially saying, about 46% reported that they thought this would be sort of widespread then poverty, deep entrenched within the US if we weren't figuring out ways to get people food on the table, shelter over their, and these were both people who currently were impacted and not impacted by the pandemic. So I think that's a widespread belief that people are struggling, people are suffering, and we need to do things about it.
Professor 𝐓𝐿𝐴nkamp, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify Muriel's point. I think one of the really unusual aspects of this particular recession is that it has made housing affordability actually worse. We've seen house prices rise actually during the pandemic, partly because there's been a long-term lack of supply of new housing in the market, but also we've seen the fact that a lot of people are highly reluctant to even show their homes during the pandemic, and that's contributed to housing prices going up because at the same time, the Federal Reserve has launched even more monetary stimulus. Mortgages are cheaper than ever, and so house prices are rising, and so complicating the fact that a lot of people are not going to be able to pay their rent and pay their mortgages. House prices are going up, and it's really getting to be a dire situation, I think.
Absolutely. And related to that, Professor Graham, I know that the latest CFO survey did indicate that in many firms, more people are working remotely, which is hardly surprising. And that has obviously been a lifesaver for people whose jobs can be done remotely. What kind of long-term effect do you expect that could have on commercial real estate? I mean, is this going to fundamentally change firms in that while tech firms have had people work from distance for a long time, more and more firms are realizing that they can increase efficiency by having people work from home? Do you expect to see more of that? And how does that kind of change the economic landscape?
Yeah, good question. So absolutely, we expect that office space won't be filled up as quickly. It won't, when the virus is finally under control, we have a vaccine out there, there will be plenty of people that go back to work in their office, but not, but 10%, let's say, or 15 to 20% of people won't go back to their office. And so that's going to put downward pressure on commercial real estate. Okay, so one, that's a sector of the economy that matters, but two, it'll be a lack of a recovery, if you will, in that sector, and that will sort of dampen things going forward. There can be some little silver linings here, right? So the cost of office space will go down for companies that do want to rent space. And likewise, by the way, the housing market's going up, as Connell mentioned. Rental market for in the cities is not, right? So that people are trying to, this is a generalization, but some people are trying to move out of cities. That should put downward pressure on rent within the city. So that's a residential side of real estate. But that might hopefully help a little bit on the housing side of the crisis that Connell identified a minute ago.
Gotcha, thank you. And Professor 𝐓𝐿𝐴𝐴𝐵, following up on that, we know that, just as there are a lot of people that can work from home, a lot of firms that can have people work from home, as you've mentioned earlier, there are parts of the economy that are really, really suffering and may not bounce back, whether, it's movie theaters or other public spaces. What particular areas of the economy are you particularly concerned about? And what kind of long-term change do you think economic life in America could see as a result of this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really worried that we're going to return to an era of empty storefronts in many communities. I think, as people have pointed out, the pandemic is amplifying a lot of trends that were already present in the economy. And John has certainly talked about a lot of those, substituting capital for labor, so laying people off and automating more heavily. I also am, as I said before, I'm really concerned about the future of small businesses. And again, one of the things that was really great about the economic recovery was that we saw a lot of not just large cities, but also small and medium-sized cities becoming revitalized in their downtowns as small businesses were moving in and taking off. And the pandemic recession has just been so devastating to that part of the economy that I think it's going to take quite a long time for that to recover. So I think that's going to happen. I think, of course, retail is changing quite dramatically, and again, it is going to affect the small end of retail. The middle is kind of on its taking its final bow, I would say, and so I think these are long-term problems that are really going to reshape the economy. And again, getting back to this idea that John was indicating about this kind of two-speed recovery, one of the things we really need to worry about is, are we really preparing people for the jobs that are expanding? Are we really preparing people to take jobs in industries that are doing well, and helping them to move out of the industries that are not going to be doing well because of these accelerated trends?
Hey, can I add one thing to comment there? So for the last 5 years, going back from 2019 and earlier, the number one concern businesses would tell us about when we would do the CFO survey was we can't find the right employees for the right jobs. So skills mismatch. And as the unemployment rate went down, this became a bigger and bigger concern. It was the main thing they were focusing on, was getting the right employees. So what we've seen over the last few quarters, not surprisingly, when the unemployment rate skyrocketed, we didn't hear so much concern about that. But already in September, we're starting to hear again that one of their top 3 concerns now, not number 1, but number 3, is finding the right employees for the right skills. So this just builds right on what Connell was just saying, is yes, there will be jobs, a year from now that aren't available now that will be. Will the employees have the right skills? Like, you can't go from working at a restaurant to being a data processing person without some training and further education. So the skills mismatch probably will, unfortunately, lengthen the transition to getting back to where we need to be, closer to a full employment. And now that I have the floor, there's one other point I could make, if you don't mind. One thing that's been very surprising, I want to build a little bit on the stock market stuff that we've been talking about. Why is the stock market so high? It's kind of near all-time records, and we're in the middle of this crazy crisis. Well, one interpretation is the market is looking out a year, and they're saying, okay, we've got some trouble here, but a year from now, things will be back to normal. You do wonder, given the conversations we've been having today, things really will be back to normal. But there is some element of the market building. Either the market is just really short-term focused, and they just think stimulus, market up, or the market is leapfrogging that and thinking things will be back to normal. So we'll all find out together whether the market has been overly optimistic about how things will be a year from now. But I think a common interpretation right now is the market is pricing in pretty good times starting a year from now. So we'll see. I hope they're right. I hope they're right.
Professor Fullenkamp, I have a feeling you might want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, certainly. I completely agree with John. I think that the market is really being optimistic, especially if you look at the types of firms whose prices are really rising, in the fact that many of them are still, back in the situation where they don't actually earn any profits. We're looking at, have highly valued tech firms and even electric car companies. And other kind of moonshot type of companies there that are getting a lot of attention on Wall Street these days, and those are inherently optimistic bets. So I think that's a big part of the backing. Now, it does have some truth to it, to the extent that a lot of what we're seeing in the modern economy is that value is being created by so-called intangible assets, which happen to revolve around ideas and better use of technology. So there are some really good fundamental reasons to be optimistic about the productivity of the economy and the profits that it will create. But there's a lot of possibility for over optimism, and I agree with Mariel, and I would love to hear about if their center's been focusing on that among investors as well, because I think a lot of people think there's a lot of over optimism in the stock market.
Yeah, so we tend to focus on LMI households, which are significantly less likely to be in the stock market, right? And if they are in the stock market, it's often because they have a workplace retirement program that's in the stock market. And so they're much less likely to be sort of active individual investors who are sort of thinking about the stocks that they want, choosing those and whatnot. But that sort of undercurrent of optimism, we are certainly finding across the board. And what I mean by that is, we also asked, how long do you think it will take for the economy to return to normal? And how long do you think it'll take for your personal, financial status to return to normal? And we asked in this most recent version of our survey, and we also asked 3 months prior to, so more towards the beginning of the pandemic. And essentially we see the same breakdown that, about 5% think that in a month or two, it'll be back to normal. So the good news is that that's only 5%. So there's at least some realism there, but we still find that about 2/3, and this was the case, 6 months ago, felt that it would be back to normal in a year. And now, then 3 months later, we still find that it's about 2/3 of people that think it'll be a year or less. So people sort of, no matter at what point you ask them in time, they're sort of saying like, oh yeah, it'll be about a year, or it'll be about 6 months. Even then after 6 months have passed, they don't sort of readjust that evaluation. So we also see that same sort of current and level of optimism. When we talk about investing and sort of investing decisions, and particularly when we think about household investors and newer investors and LMI household investors, they tend to want to invest in things that they know, right? Name brands that they're familiar with. And so that's why you see sort of extra confidence in things that they've heard a lot in the news about, or that they personally have used, or that they have experience with. So that also likely overinflates some of the value, because they're not necessarily paying attention to, profits and losses and some of that long-term projections.
Thank you very much. And just for anybody who missed it, LMI is low to middle income, in case anybody wasn't familiar with that terminology. Professor Graham, I'd like to come back to you. We've had a question about something that you mentioned earlier. You said about there are some sectors that have done pretty well through this, for different reasons, and some not so much. Could you talk a little bit about any particular sectors that are either particularly struggling or doing well just because of different circumstances through the pandemic?
Right. Well, right. My general comment here has been that businesses that are people facing and or need their employees to be physically at work are the ones struggling. So assembly lines, meat packing, restaurants, movie theaters, we kind of probably all have a sense of that. The ones that are doing reasonably well are ones that their demand is still there, and or they are able to operate with less of that intensive contact between the customer and the employee. And so here we have, again, kind of on the IT side is one place that's doing very well. Between, of course, Zoom is one example, but anything that's facilitating that working from home, or us replacing what we would have normally done in person, doing it from our home, right? So whether that be some forms of entertainment, Netflix, think, or some aspects of grocery shopping and home delivery. And as I mentioned earlier, Amazon, that type of home delivery is doing reasonably well. Even, Walmart's setting records for themselves for their home delivery aspect of their business, which is offsetting the fact that fewer people are coming to the store. So again, I would think primarily in terms of that flexibility and that contact intensiveness between the customer and the employee as we sort of define those industries.
Sure, thank you.
Sorry, one thing that I would add that as we think about industries that are doing better and businesses that are doing better, a lot of times we think that, oh, well, but as soon as the pandemic is under control, people will go back to going to the movie theaters, or people will go back to going out to eat at restaurants. But they're really sort of undercounting the fact that habits are sticky. And people have sort of adjusted to, to some aspects of pandemic life. And if behavioral science, tells us anything, one of the things that it tells us is that our prior behavior predicts our future behavior. And so, the fact is that it'll take a lot longer for things, even once the pandemic is done, because you then have to also retrain people or break habits, because people have found like, oh, it's actually really convenient to get my groceries delivered, or it's really convenient for me to order all of these things online rather than having to go into shops and stores and places, even once it's, safer to do so. So I think that's just a thing to keep in mind, that individual habits will be much stickier and longer than it's, great, we've got a vaccine, it's safe to go back into these public spaces, and then, the next week our numbers are back to normal. It's these individual behaviors are sticky. They will last a long time. We will see a decrease in spending on eating out, likely for a much longer time period than just the correlation of danger with COVID.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Professor 𝐓𝐡𝐞, would like to come back to you. You mentioned earlier on about the uncertainty around the election and the effect that has on the stock market, because the markets seem to be expecting that there'll be a few weeks of uncertainty after the election. This 2020 certainly feels like one of the most unpredictable years that we have had, certainly in recent memory. But if you were to look only in isolation at the stock market, does it reflect patterns that we've seen in previous kind of strange years? Is 2020 as unprecedented as we expect, or has the stock market actually followed fairly predictable patterns based on the things that have been happening?
Well, actually, I think the stock market always defies your expectations. I think that's a handy rule of thumb, and I think this year has been no different. And we've talked about one of the big ways in which it has, in the fact that we had unprecedented rates of economic decline. The economy contracted at something like a 30% annual rate in the second quarter of 2020. And yet the stock market, seemed to keep going up and up. So I think that has been kind of a big surprise on the upside of the stock market. Nonetheless, what we are seeing is, and we've talked about this also, the impact of uncertainty on the market, and the market kind of holding its breath and waiting to see about the outcomes of certain types of either political or economic events. One of the things that really strikes me is that we're in a moment that is very much like the end of say 2008, going into 2009, when it was really unclear whether the banking industry in the US was really going to survive, or if it was going to go into further decline and possibly even collapse. And the markets were really holding their breath. It was really holding its breath at that point. Now, that was following a big decline because of the financial panic, which was a bit of a different situation. But we're really seeing that same kind of impact, as we've talked about, of uncertainty. Nobody making any big moves, nobody making any big decisions, really just waiting and seeing to see how the uncertainty was going to be resolved. And I think that is a very common pattern that we see in these unpredictable years, that people find some kind of defining event that we kind of all wait for. And then when that event comes, whatever the outcome is, as John said earlier, once the uncertainty is resolved, then it becomes no longer this thing to worry about. It becomes a problem to be solved. And then people get on with the business of solving those problems. And that's actually better for both the markets and the economy.
Sure, thank you. Something else I'd like to get your perspective on, and Mary or Beasley, I'd love to hear what you think, what behavioral science might tell us about how people react to this. On October 22nd, the FDA will meet to consider the Pfizer vaccine application. And if there is, if they find that this thing can move forward, and maybe it seems like a vaccine is getting closer because the entire world is kind of pinning its hopes right now on a vaccine, would you expect to see, Professor 𝐓𝐿𝐴𝐴𝐵, like in the markets, would you expect to see a big reaction to that? And Mary or Beasley, would you expect to see, people's individual confidence rebound? Like, what kind of effect could that have if there is a major development on that day?
Well, certainly you're going to see some positive moves in the market. I think I've been actually kind of surprised at how little how little reaction we've been getting in the market from some of the information that's been coming out, both positive and negative, about the vaccines. There are I've been following this a little bit, and there are multiple therapeutic approaches that seem to be doing well and seem to be moving much faster towards approval than people had thought. And I think that when it really gets out that one or more of these therapies are both effective and they're going to be widely available, I think we will see a positive impact on the market. But again, I've been kind of scratching my head because these events, which you would expect to really drive the market in this kind of a situation, have really not been. They've been knocked out basically by the election. We've talked about that as well.
Yeah, and from a sort of individual behavior thing, I think there's, again, we'll see sort of disparate reactions to the sort of actually having a vaccine released. And one is that, like, one of the real challenges is already that there's increasing rates of vaccine hesitancy in the United States, even prior to all of this. And the last several years have really kind of eroded trust in the scientific community. And a lot of the sort of media and discourse around the vaccine, around the sort of rushed process has really sort of undermined some of the trust in the sort of process of creating a vaccine. And I think that that's actually going to be a major hurdle for individual adoption of vaccination rates, because I think there's a lot of people that that essentially there's definitely a number of people who and a large portion of the population who basically won't feel safe until there's a vaccine, right? And that does feel like a major decision point, a turning point in when it will become safe to go out to do, to go out to eat in restaurants and things like that, is when there's a vaccine. But the flu vaccine only has about a 45% uptake rate in any given year. And so it's also quite possible that if this has also a very low uptake rate of the vaccine, that it's also going to kind of underdeliver on its promise of herd immunity and really protecting the citizenry. So it's a real challenge, and we really ought to be thinking creatively about how do we really promote the uptake of this vaccine when it comes out, if we really actually want it to have the intended effect and impact that we want it to have. Because I personally am particularly just worried about the reactions and the distrust in science and people sort of just really increased vaccine hesitancy in being able to have this be an effective solution. And
sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that I would add is, we actually have, like, everybody's sort of treating the vaccine as like, oh, this is what's going to solve COVID-19 and it's going to like solve the problem for everybody. And we actually already have the solutions for solving the COVID problem. And it's like, if everybody just washed their hands all the time, wore a mask, and like social distanced for a month, like we'd have this taken care of. But that individual behavior gets in the way. And I think that individual behavior of, vaccine hesitancy is going to get in the way again, even as the vaccine comes out.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And I point out for everybody watching and listening, we had our last briefing on the vaccines was on September 18th, and we addressed the issue of hesitancy and reluctance. You can certainly check that out. And we will have another briefing on October 20th about the latest in vaccine development. So we're going to be wrapping up here shortly. Before we do, I'd like to go to each of our panelists and ask you the same question, which is, in this current economic moment, with so much uncertainty, what is one thing that you would like to see, either from the government, from the business sector, or anywhere else, to maybe begin to turn the situation around and improve it, at least in the short term? And Professor Graham, we'll start with you.
Okay, so I very much appreciate and agree with the points Mario was just making. So when I say that my next statement, I'm not that I'm ignoring them. I think the goal here is to get through the next year. So I don't mean to say everything will be perfect or back to normal even, but certainly we'll be better off a year from now than we are. So from the government sector, how do we get through the next year, right? Even if you're a small government person, which I respect that, this is probably not the time to have the philosophical debate. This is probably the time the government does need to help and do the stimulus packages for probably both business and individuals to help us get through the next year. A year from now, we can have our long run arguments about size of government. Likewise, for corporations, there's been a little bit of a move lately. Is our goal the firm to maximize stock price, or is our goal to take care of our employees and be good community citizens and such? And so companies have been saying they're shifting more towards these other stakeholders, as we call them, rather than just shareholders. Well, this is a time to do that. Again, for the next year at least, right? It's the time to take care of your employees and maybe keep them on the payrolls longer than you otherwise would, so we can all get through the next year. And a year from now, we can rebalance and re-equilibrate, I think. So get through the next year, Greg. That's what I'm leaving you with.
Gotcha. Thank you. Muriel Beasley, what's your take?
So I think what I would really love to see is getting more cash in hand for folks for that day-to-day piece. But I would like to see a part of it that is for basic necessities that folks have, but also having actually a part of it be, and this is sort of as an idea that's been floating around the Center for Advanced Hindsight in general, which is to have a part of it actually be sort of a gift card that is branded for spending at local businesses. Because I do think it's so important to get that cash infusion into some of our local businesses. And then as part of that, I would like to see more forgiveness and less loans, or more grants and less loans. Loans and forbearance in many cases is sort of kicking the can down the road and saying, great, you don't have to worry about this for the next 3 months, but then in 3 months or in 6 months, you're going to have to deal with, you're going to continue to have your costs and things like that. And now you're also going to have loan payments, or you're going to have to sort of make up all of the things, all of the payments that you missed. So I'd really like to see more grants and forgiveness, less loans and sort of just delays, and getting cash in hand, but earmarking at least a portion of it for that spending in local economies.
Sure, thank you. And Professor 𝐓𝐿-𝐿𝐼.
Thanks. I think that this has been a really nice stepping into this, because I think John gave a great kind of big picture of what has to happen. I certainly agree with that. I think Mariel's comments about the types of individual stimuli and what they have to do is spot on. And I would only add that I think the other missing piece then is for governments to step in and facilitate the return kind of back to normal. And by that, I mean, getting back to an earlier comment of mine, really helping businesses understand how to cope with the virus, how to make sure that their facilities are safe, how do we make sure that the schools are safe for everybody so that students and teachers can return. So government needs to coordinate and facilitate the return back to the economy. And I think if we combine that with a targeted stimulus of a sufficient size, then we can really get getting things back to normal as quickly as we can. So that's really the missing piece in my mind, is that this government providing information, providing facilitation, and spending the resources on things that will make people comfortable and confident to actually resume their normal activities.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. I think we will leave it there. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Muriel Beasley, John Graham, and 𝐓𝐿-𝐿𝐼 for sharing your perspectives with us today. Next week's briefing will be on voting rights, a crucial topic in the upcoming election, and especially here in North Carolina, which is considered to be crucial to the presidential race this year. If you'd like to be on the list for future briefings, please email news@duke.edu to let us know. In the meantime, please stay well and be sure to vote. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks.